Okay. So, Cliff.
Tom, how are you?
Good, man. You know,
Good to
we're
see you
making
again.
a baptism here today.
Absolutely.
I mean, Gateway.
Fire.
Gateway has been around. You may remember, I came to New Haven in 1971, and you came, what year?
69.
69.
Yeah.
And so Gateway originally started, they were at Wilbercross High School.
Right.
But they were in a small little area, right, the street that leads up to Wilbercross, even before they moved over to Wilbercross High School. So, you know, the history of this institution is fantastic, and I see Dr. Lincoln from time to time around town, and Pegues, Mrs. Cheryl Pegues. So I see old timers, and now, and I won't say that you're an old timer, but but you've been around for almost.
I've been.
You taught initially over at Long Wharf.
Long Wharf, and I taught at Hamden High, taught at Satellite School. I taught at East Branford, North Branford High School. So those are like satellite schools. And North Haven, on the North Haven campus as well.
Indeed. So I wanted to kind of chat with you a little bit, because knowing that the sincere investment of working with students in terms of working and teaching and collaborating with students in terms of history, and I think you've taught philosophy before as well, and ethics, political science. So the whole gamut of if you will, what we call the humanities kind of thing. And you were kind enough to kind of let me talk to some of your students to kind of pinch hit. And it dawned on me this most recent 4 weeks ago, just the breadth of experience that the students bring and the breadth of experience that you bring. So I know you just came from your class. I won't be too hard on you, because I know the students do kind of they don't exhaust you. But I've started teaching myself fundamentals of communication, and I've noticed you take them under your wing.
You do.
So you have about 1,000+ children, and even probably some grandchildren, because it's over 20 years ago that you taught. So somebody that you might have encountered at either Long Wharf or any of the other satellites that you mentioned might have a child now.
Yes.
And although you're 16, we will agree that you're just a perpetually youth.
I'll be 17 this year.
In terms of your outlook. So I wanted to chat with you and just kind of, not necessarily pick your brain, kind of have a little bit of a mind meld, about history or philosophy or politics or whatever's on your mind in this day and age in 2017, as we kind of think about necessarily where you and I are on the planet, but also kind of where our young people are and our adults are, and just where the world is in the context of the academic mentorship approach that you've brought to life.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I want to first just thank you publicly and privately for the work you do and how you educate, enlighten, use the communication, your blog, your other vehicles to get to enlighten and educate me and so many others. And I thank you for that, which is why I reached out to you to come talk to my class.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. It's funny you mentioned this. So in terms of the students first, teaching the Gateway these nearly 20 years has been a great experience for me, and I'm grateful to certainly Dr. Kendrick and those who preceded her for opening this door of opportunity for me. And I can't tell you, I can't hardly go anywhere in New Haven, grocery store, mall, in the streets, wherever it might be, when a former student will come and just acknowledge me and appreciate what they learned, and how they're trying to carry on that tradition to their children or their family members. And yes, indeed, I've had children of students I've taught who now take my classes. And it's funny how the reverse is true. I've had parents of students I've taught, young people who are 18 and 19 will go tell their parents about it, and their parents will now come take the class.
That's right, the benefit of the senior citizen.
Exactly. So it's very interesting that way, that dynamic. And of course, presently I have a 95-year-old elder taking my class, the African American history class, and it's so enlightening and refreshing. And she's like a student assistant, teacher assistant, because she's so much wealth and knowledge she brings to the table. Her activism in the community on social issues helps boost and bolster and corroborate a lot of what I say.
And when you talk about Paul Robeson in one of your classes, you have a person that's seen and has been in Paul's presence. And I don't think Joelle Fishman would mind us talking. It's her mother.
It's her mother, yes, Miss Fishman.
And so the purpose of the community college's public information is we're transparent, we're authentic. So Joelle Fishman's mother is in your class. It was in last semester also.
Yes, she's a wonderful. She's in front of the class, and she adds so much. And because of her own experiences, as you mentioned, Paul Robeson in particular, she made sure the class knew that she heard Paul Robeson and sing in person. She went to Paul Robeson rallies and marches and demonstrations and was out there proactive herself. So having someone in the class who can relate and share
Indeed.
experiences is so beneficial to me.
Indeed.
And more importantly to our students.
That's yes. 95 years old.
Yeah, 95, going strong.
Yes, and going very strong.
Going strong. Shows up every class, and she shames some other students who not even a fraction of her age who come dragging in sometimes for one reason or another. But she's so that's the value, I guess, as you said, of community
Absolutely.
college, and the fact that these are young people and then elders as well who come from our community, from all aspects, not just from New Haven.
Yes, the Greater New Haven area.
Greater New
Yes.
Haven area.
Yes.
And the fact that they have this desire to learn, and the fact that especially when you talk about history and the importance of history, it's important for them to understand the world in which they live, the streets that they walk every day, experiences that they see and have gone through already as young people. And let's just be real about we talk about the violence in our community, the drug dealing, somehow in some places wretched conditions that they come from. That it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen, on their watch necessarily. But there's an historical correlation to all this. And in fact, one student today we were discussing the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And Emmett Till and Rosa Parks, and at the end I asked were there any questions, and a couple students raised their hand and said, "Well, look, I just want to talk about the rise of the projects and the infusion of drugs and guns in our community." And I said, "Well, wait." I said, "Yes, that's good." I said, because we'll get to that in a couple of weeks when we talk about the 70s and 80s in particular. But you're absolutely right for pinpointing this era, the 40s and the 50s, because that's what precipitated what transpired in the 70s and 80s. And so the reaction to, response to. So the fact that they're thinking ahead and seeing the connection, I think is important.
It's very important.
And I appreciate that. And the fact that, again, our young people get such a bad rap by society. And there's so many deserving and giving and talented and brilliant young people, black, white, Latino, in our midst, who just looking for a chance, looking for an opportunity to learn. And I encourage them every day, take that knowledge and use it for the not only your own benefit, but for the benefit of our community.
Indeed. And I noticed when I was in your class, as you already indicated, they do inspire one another as well.
Yeah.
And not necessarily challenge, but there's that it's a healthy and safe environment where we're unique, but we're also part of the collective, but we also see some parts of reality differently and different. So some of the conversations when I was there, some of them were talking about, various strategies and tactics, whether violence, nonviolence, whether you're pacifist, how do you create change and sustain change, given your personality and your position in life. So the community college opportunity, and the price is still going up a little bit, but it still is quite reasonable. And I think even there's a deadline. I'm not sure when we're going to air this show, but there's some scholarships that students are eligible to apply for. I think the deadline's been extended. If you're a student here at Gateway, there are several scholarships available. So there's just so much available in my mind, and I've just been impressed. I've started to teach fundamentals of communication here as a requisite course. And again, speeches are speeches, but people are not necessarily moved by speeches or public speaking anymore. So when I emphasize in terms of fundamentals of communication, and I noticed in your class as well, we're communicating why. Are we communicating to nurture? Are we communicating to inspire? Are we communicating to uplift? Are we communicating just to kind of get to know ourselves? When we came out, not necessarily came out of the cave, but we had that European thing of after people left Africa, writing on, is that innate impulse to kind of document our existence even on a cave. So whether it's a DNA or native kind of instinct, how does that kind of now manifest in when we have these fake news and a lot of controversy about what's going on in D.C. and whether dystopia, people are using this term. Have you heard this term DYSTOPI? It's a very pessimistic term, kind of the George Orwell. So George Orwellian, 1984. Right. It's a takeoff on George that are we back into that dark age, that white plague, if I can make a pun on terms, once again, and how will we as civilization rise up? And that's where I found that because your class is really in tune. I think you were talking about, for example, Emmett Till today, and someone threw in something just happened even recently.
Yeah, we did. In fact, today we were discussing the aftermath of World War II. African American soldiers distinguishing themselves, like the Triple Nickels, the 5th and 55th all-black paratroop patrol, which again defying stereotype and prejudice and becoming a top-notch troop, battalion rather than the military. Certainly the Tuskegee Airmen, the most know about. as well, and countless others. I mean, there were scores of other African American battalions of soldiers, and individually and collectively, who distinguished themselves in many ways. So, folks, but the idea was this: part of the theory was, the philosophy was, that governed and guided folks in World War II, was that, you know, we still had this battle going on here. It was still an ongoing battle. We had Marcus Garvey, who, of course, had died in 1940, but it set in motion a movement to challenge and to uplift black people. Then, of course, you still had A. Philip Randolph around, W.B. Du Bois around, Mary Clyde Bethune, and a score of the Nation of Islam was rising. So you had scores of other organizations and individuals who were challenging America at its core.
Indeed.
Paul Robeson in particular, among others. But yet, the war breaks out, and then it's like there's a split in the black community. Well, should we fight or should we not?
Indeed.
Well, why should we fight? You know, this country is still not treating us as first-class citizens. But the sentiment ended up swaying toward becoming engaged and becoming involved in this, led by certain leaders. And so we had scores of black men fighting. But the concept was, the premise, okay, we'll go fight. And so there was this double V that came out of the World War II. And black community, you have people raising both hands with V's. Victory at home, victory abroad.
Indeed.
We'll go fight the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese, but we're also concerned about victory here.
That's
Fighting
right.
against injustice and racism here in America.
Throw in the black press, because the black press helped to promote like crazy.
Absolutely.
The
Black
NNPA,
was
the
critical.
National Newspaper Publishers Association.
Thank you so much. And NNPA absolutely was critical in getting that word out and actually in underscoring and highlighting the discrepancies and disparities in how black people were treated in the armed services, highlighting the accomplishments of the Triple Nichols and the Tuskegee Airmen, and then, of course, this double V. Saying we're going to go fight. Yes, we're going to fight, but we're not losing sight on the fight back home. So again, the war ends. People come back. Scores of soldiers come back home, saying, hey, you know what? We went and fought against this Hitler, this dictator Hitler and Mussolini. Fought against the Japanese sovereignty, and now we're back home, and things have not changed. We're going to be a part of the catalyst. We're going to be on the cutting edge of change. And so, again, with Du Bois and Randolph and Mary Clyde Bethune and Islam, Nation of Islam all around, Charles Hamilton Houston coming on the scene with the NAACP, with Thurgood Marshall, and, of course, Constance Baker Miley and others. So we began to fight this battle on different fronts. So today we discussed, of course, in the midst of all this, you have the Emmett Till case, Mississippi. You have the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, led by Rosa Parks and E.D. Nixon and others. And, of course, we had Rosa Parks and the Brown vs. Board of Education case.
Indeed.
1954. And all these events converging, which further revitalized, if you will, and certainly initiated a movement of here in the modern civil rights movement.
Indeed.
So we discussed that in some detail today, and then at the end, I had a couple of students raise their hands and say, hey, Ms. Graves, we want to talk about the rise of the projects and or what happened, what caused the rise of the projects and the gun dealing and the drug dealing in our communities. And so I say I should, then we would get back to that, because there is a connection. There's a connection,
and still very somewhat controversial in terms of how do we research what has occurred in the past and whether there's an objectivity and transparency and true investigation. I mean, we know about conspiracy theories and some things that might have happened in the past that we'll never know about. But our good friend Maxine Waters has been in the news in the last few days in terms of her situation with Bill O'Reilly. But people have forgotten that Maxine talked about the infusion of drugs into the black community, whether or not our people in D.C., our elected leaders, our president, et cetera, kind of caused, through the CIA connection, kind of caused our drugs to be crack in particular, to kind of come into America for South American and Central American kind of geopolitical issues. So, and then if you go back to the Opium War, which doesn't necessarily particularly pertain to African American history, but it pertains to U.S. history in terms of what's going on in Asia and Admiral Perry and others. So, drugs and pharmaceuticals have really been part of. You can look at you can look at that also from a sense of international monopolizing international commerce and economy, and how citizens might be impacted negatively. On the flip side, heroin, as many of your students also know, I think you're going to talk about drugs also in your class, was considered the wonder drug in the 1860s, 1870s, 1890s when it first discovered, and only the white upper class could really have access to it. So you had a lot of white women become addicted to heroin, and also Freud was also an addict, because again it was considered a wonder drug. But one of your students, I think you mentioned to me before we started, talked about, although in terms of Emmett Till, there was a recent thing in the news where the person that accused him,
right, Miss Bryant,
yeah, and she recanted her story.
Yeah.
So we can't bring Emmett Till back in bodily form, but we can bring back Emmett and Mamie and the countless others that we don't even know of that were killed. Not to mention Swerner and others. So this history can sometimes be vibrant if you as an individual see yourself to be part of the historical continuum.
Well, it's interesting. I have a couple of middle-aged white women in my class. Not Miss Fishman. These are women who are younger than Miss Fishman. But in the 50s and 60s. And so they've been around a while, and they talk about and they make sure that the class is aware of. And I appreciated the role that women played, black and white women played,
yes,
and played historically in our struggle for civil rights and human rights. And they brought up an interesting point today when we talked about Emmett Till and Miss Bryant, the fact that, and they're right, that in some instances, not all instances, but in many instances, white women who also oppressed and treated, and especially in the South and but even North too, treated second-class citizens even in their own families that were oftentimes coerced or manipulated into making up stories or fabricating stories by their fathers, by their brothers, by their husbands, or significant others to go after, to give us an excuse an excuse for lynchings and beatings and shootings and killings of black men in particular. So, and the fact that Mrs. Bryant, the lady accused who Emmett Till supposedly said, "Hey, baby," to as he was leaving the store. She was the proprietor of the worker at the store where he made this comment, which led to his death. Recanted her whatever she testified to at that time. Oh yeah, he did come to me and say this. Well, that's significant. So, but it's consistent with history again.
That's right.
About we have any number of instances where stories were created, manufactured, made up, lied about, and to justify or to give a rationale for, or an excuse for the oppression, the brutality that followed. And an interesting note about, and there have been not a lot of books and articles written about Emmett Till over the years. In fact, even a movie, a couple of films have been made about him, about his story. And what I try to tell the class is that Emmett Till, what made him unique was the fact that all this attention was brought on him. The fact that the black press that you mentioned earlier was there, and the NAACP was there at the trial to document and record what transpired, to tell the world the picture of Emmett Till's, the manipulated and badly beaten body was on the cover of Jet magazine.
Yes.
So millions of black people and white around the country got a chance to see this horrific story unfold. So and that's what distinguished him from scores of other lynchings and shootings and brutal brutal killings and beatings of black people around the country. And it made it unique in some ways, but it was in not a lot of ways it was similar too. And this story had been told time and time again, but we're fortunate that his story was recorded to help inspire and motivate. So much as you know, at the African American History Museum and Culture in Washington, there's a whole section of the museum that's dedicated to Emmett Till.
Yes.
And so which symbolizes that era of repression and brutality that African Americans experienced.
And just as we conclude, because we're not going to.
Sure, go ahead.
Just as we conclude, because we want to tease people that if they see this, and they will have to come back and tune in again, because it's so important, and I really appreciate you for being available to kind of begin to share. And so there's a wealth of information in the greater New Haven area.
Absolutely.
There's a wealth of people that are valuable, committed to kind of contributing. Just as we conclude, when you mentioned the World War II and the debate about are we fighting on both fronts, people forget also that Douglas had the same kind of discussion. Had the same
Civil War.
The same discussion, the Civil War.
Same discussion.
And some would suggest that was one of the reasons that his white kind of buddy, the abolitionist, Garrison, that was the reason for the friction between Garrison and Frederick in terms of who do we fight for. If the house is on fire, as Martin Luther King would say 100 years or so later, do we want to become a fire person, or do we want to let the house burn down and construct something new? And you and I were talking about that also earlier in terms of the need for a new, in my mind, a new constitution, not just amendments or band-aids to the situation, but we need a new constitution for no other reason than people forget that the 3/5 clause, that the Constitution was constructed with this 3/5 clause, where you had this schizophrenic duality where at one point your ancestors, at the same point, your ancestors, my ancestors were considered property, material goods, but also we had political power in terms of our 3/5 from a taxation and representation standpoint, but not individually being able to exercise it. So we were commodities on two fronts, and that was a master stroke in terms of political science. I'm being neutral here in terms of the value judgment, but that's never happened. And if you think of world history and constitutions, never ever in terms of constitutions and voting, et cetera, have you had that duality made in a constitutional document. Now, democracy was a new phenomenon because you've just gotten over the king and queen kind of phenomenon. Right. Even in England, we're not over the king and queen phenomenon as some other nations. But yeah, that was a master. So when we talk about this American experiment, it's built on schizophrenia and duality and really astute compromise. But we're in a stage now as we conclude in 2017 that I think everyone can see that perhaps things have been broken in so many ways, and we've tried to amend things for so often in terms of 1820, 1850, the various compromises to prevent the Civil War. Then we go into the Civil War. Then we have 1876, with the electoral compromise again, and we go with the Bush-Gore kind of coup. I'll phrase it. It was really a coup, the Supreme Court coup. But again, so I think if we look at our American history, forget black, white, reality, American, we see that there have been these attempts to mollify, to compromise, to merge, in spite of the brutality and barbarity of how to go from 13 colonies from sea to shining sea. So I'm not trying to propose an anarchist viewpoint. On the contrary, things change. We might have the word horsepower. But we don't necessarily, it's a different motif. So we're into a quantum world. We're into a light speed world where you can see the changes that society, the evolving nature of what it means as a civilization and a country and a world. So I'm suggesting to you that our political instruments, i.e. constitutions, might also have to really undergo some really strict scrutiny, to use a good Scalia phrase, of what the import and power and appropriateness of this particular civil contract is. So we're going to have you back and talk more. I'm going to give you some kind of concluding words, but I just wanted to kind of lift that up about how you're in the midst several times a week of really thinking seriously and hearing serious thoughts about what does the future of people on the planet mean.
Well, of course, you're always the scholar philosopher in terms of looking at the big picture, and I think you're right. At some point, we may have to get to that point, but I do think short term. What I tell our students is, look, if nothing else, an overhaul of the Constitution may be in order, Tom, but I do think, if nothing else, Americans of all stripes need to look at this doggone electoral college. I mean, the election 2000 and the most recent election certainly it's just crying out to us. Look at this electoral college system. Even though look at the history, why it was set up, how it was set up, how it's been implemented, and how it's certainly conflicted with our one person, one vote.
That's right.
Basic voting premise, democratic premise in 2000 and in 2016, and we have to embrace that and try to figure out a way to correct that. And I think, and I put the challenge and the burden on this generation. It's on them. They have to. It's on their watch to be proactive in that approach and looking at this thing. And one final thing before we go, I mean, this is being taped on March 30th. Going back to the Constitution. So March 30th is the date in 1870 that the U.S. Congress ratified, or the country ratified the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. And again, that's another contradiction. It's the schizophrenia you talked about. So in that matter, the Civil War, the Republican-dominated Congress passes a bill, and then becomes a constitutional amendment to let black men vote. Black women couldn't vote because white women couldn't vote. Women generally couldn't vote for 50 years later. So black men had the right to vote, but sadly that was almost shortly diminished because in the aftermath of the 1876 compromise you mentioned, Hayes Tilden, got Hayes elected, and he agreed to pull the troops out, federal troops out the South, and to basically close the eye to Southern repression. Southern white men retook the state houses, legislatures, and imposed, of course, these Jim Crow laws that basically took away the right by putting grandfather clauses, literacy tests, et cetera, and just outright domestic terrorist activities.
Right.
Essentially took the right to vote away from black men, and which basically remained intact until 1950s and 60s.
Yes.
So again,
and Kalila, our good friend Kalila Dean Brown will say even continue in terms
to
of
this very day.
voter suppression and panels you've been on recently.
Absolutely, exactly. So the struggle continues.
Indeed.
We made progress, and I instill this to my students, and I'm sure you do the same in terms of communication. We have to understand and appreciate. Yes, let's look for where we've come from. Let's acknowledge the fact that progress has been made. We have to be real talk, as they would say, as the young people say. But at the same time, recognize and acknowledge we still have a ways to go.
Yes.
A long ways to go in terms of racial, and social, and economic justice in this country.
And kudos, just as we kind of conclude, Cliff, when you mentioned the need for the abolition of the Electoral College. Gateway Community College has had a relationship with various professors, a relationship with Yale where they've invited professors to speak. So you had, there's no question you have the foremost professor of law who happens to be at Yale University, Akil Omar, spoke here about the need to, that this Electoral College is really a slap in the face and a black mark on our so-called the apparition of democracy. And until it's removed, we will all remain blind. So again, thank you, my man.
Thank you, Thomas.
We're going to do it again.
Yes, sir.
And thanks to Gateway Community College for being really an eternal and I think transformative experience for all of us.
Absolutely, especially the Education and Technology Department. I want to thank them for making this happen.
Amen. Amen.